I alluded in the last presentation to the problem of Jericho. And Jericho is a difficult site. Probably most of you, if you look at some of your study notes in your Bibles, you have an NIV study Bible, I'm not sure what it says there, but it'll talk about they found the ruins of Jericho, and there was a wall that was found there that seems to be the wall that Joshua destroyed. There are difficulties with that. There are some real difficulties with that. But again, you need to be aware of some of the challenges and some of the difficulties that these confront. Here's the biblical narrative. Here's the core storyline that we are familiar with. The conquest in the book of Joshua talks about the city of Jericho as being a town that's fortified with gates. If you remember when Rahab hides the spies on the roof underneath the flax, some of the administrators of the city, the guards of the city come and inquire where they are and so forth. And she says, well, they got out of town before you close the gate. And so go pursue after them along the Jordan River and maybe you'll find them. Of course, she's actually going to give them eventual directions to go hide in the hills behind the city. But this is some of the data. Rahab is described as living in or on the wall, which always raises curious questions, especially if you're thinking in terms of a wall that's 6 inches thick. I know she might have been a very thin woman, but that would be an extreme. The Bible will, of course, describe that the walls fell down, Joshua 6, verse 20. And, of course, the Bible describes that the city of Jericho is destroyed and burned as a harem, as a devoted to destruction, Joshua chapter 6, verse 21, verse 24. So most of us are familiar with that. Now, dealing first with the question of living on the wall. Most of the towns in the late Bronze Age, and let me give you a quick aside here, the late Bronze Age is defined in most of the literature as 1550 BC to 1200 BC. So basically, no matter which Exodus concept you subscribe to, assuming you believe there was an Exodus, it occurred in the late Bronze Age. Now, it may have been early in the late Bronze Age, we'll talk briefly about that, or it may have been late in the late Bronze Age. But it was still in the late Bronze Age. Now, during the late Bronze Age, the Egyptians had basic control of the country. They'd come down apparently around 1550-ish, 1500 BC, and sort of whacked all of these towns and brought them under submission. I won't go into the backgrounds and history of all of that. And most of the fortifications, if there were any still in the late Bronze Age, most of the fortifications were reused Middle Bronze Age fortifications. In other words, they were left over. Now, I realize you probably more than you ever wanted to know, but I'm going to try and give you some orientation to this here in a moment. What this means is a lot of the towns in the land of Canaan did not have any fortifications at all. And those that did have fortifications were overwhelmingly left over from Middle Bronze Age, with maybe one or two, and this is open to argument, new sites that had fortifications built in the late Bronze Age. But here's what these would look like. This is a photograph of a site in Dan. This is biblical Dan that the children of Israel conquer, narrated in the book of Judges. And this, however, dates from the Middle Bronze Age. This is from the time of the patriarchs. This is part of a mud brick city gate that was discovered back in the 70s, 80s, I forget exactly which decade, but fairly recent. And in the excavation, you can look at this and you can see a blocked up opening. This is half of the opening of the doorway. There's a flight of steps that come up, and then there is the enclosed doorway. A model of this will give you a pretty good view of what this looks like. That would be the side of that opening that is over there. But this is how the fortifications would look. Here's the gateway, and there is this sloped glacis that is here with some representation on the top of a wall that probably extended higher than that. So you'd have a vertical wall up on the top with a slope coming down and an opening through the slope by which people would have access to it. Now, this is a cross-section of this fortification. These are the slopes on each side with the core middle that is hidden here, and then you would have on top of that a wall that probably would extend above it. The width of the top of that wall is about 15 to 18 feet. Now, that may seem rather narrow to you, but that's about the same as a single wide mobile home, all right, to give you some point of reference. The houses in the ancient world were not typically large. And if she's up on top of all of this and her house is on the wall, it could very easily simply be up there, with a wall on the outside, maybe a window high up by which she lets down the spies, and she live on top of the wall, which basically just extends the fortifications to a higher level. Now, I'm personally inclined to think this is likely what is described in the narrative. Now, this is the glacis, the remnant of the glacis that is found at Jericho. Now, this is a drawing of the glacis, which you notice they've drawn the protrusion on top of this as an extension on top of the slope. And the slope that we have here would correspond to what we have in the photograph to the left. Now, obviously not much of it left. It's badly eroded, deteriorated, and so forth. But there does seem to be the possibility of a reused Middle Bronze Age fortification with perhaps something 15 to 18 feet on the top, on which then there may have been some domicile in which she lived. Alternatively, people often refer to what is known as a casemate wall. There's not much evidence of many casemate walls earlier in the land of Canaan, but if you want to think in terms of that, this is a aerial photograph of a casemate wall from the side of Hatzor. Doesn't look like much, but this is the wall. These two walls that we have run in parallel with the cross sections between them. These would essentially be rooms. Here is a drawing of a casemate wall that we would have down here. They're basically two parallel walls with the cross walls between them in which people might live or they might store things and so forth. Now, the thickness that is involved here would be, let me see, looking at the scale, we're looking at 5 meters. So we're looking at the room would be 3.5 meters, which would be 10, 11 feet wide. Not a big house, but then people in the ancient world, unless it was a palace, didn't typically have a big house anyway. I'm not inclined to think of it as a casemate. Here is the casemate wall there at Hatzor. When I was there a couple of years ago visiting, it doesn't look like much, but you can see the inner wall and the outer wall with the opening in between it in this case, and you can get some sense of scale by looking at the guy walking along the edge of it there. So they're pretty good size. Now, not as big as the houses we customarily live in, but certainly for people that are sort of living in a small, cramped environment, it would be fairly adequate. Now, there are problems that we inevitably have with the date of the Exodus. You just need to be aware of this. I'm not going to go into the huge convoluted discussion of this, but there are 2 points of reference that often come into play. The first one is 1 Kings 6 verse 1, which is sort of the quick and dirty calculation. It's the easy one. If we think in terms of Solomon coming to the throne in 970 BC, and then we go on the basis of the statement here, in the 480th year after the children of Israel come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign, he began to build the temple. Well, you take 970, subtract the 4th year of his reign, and add back to that 480 years, you come up with 1446 BC. And therefore, it is the 15th century, the 1400s, and this is sometimes referred to as the early date. Easy, fairly straightforward, and a lot of folks subscribe to this date for the Exodus. Hold this thought because we're going to come back to it. The other point of reference is the one out of Exodus chapter 1, verse 11, where the Bible says that the children of Israel were involved in the construction of the store cities of Pithom and Ramesses. Usually, it is assumed that the reference to Ramesses is a reference to probably Ramesses II, who comes to the throne in about 1279 BC, hence the 13th century, the 1200s, and this would be referred to as the late date. Again, hold this thought because we're going to come back to it. Now, as we think in terms of Jericho and the excavations that go on there, the first series of excavations were conducted in 1907 and 1909 by Salin and Watzinger, a couple of German excavators who were very good for the time. But the problem is it was in the infancy of archaeology, and the finds that were discovered there are of limited value. So we really can't do much with it. Much has happened since then. The next series of excavations were by John Garstang, a British fellow excavating 1930 to 1936. He's the one on whose basis the argument is made, the wall that fell down has been discovered and so forth. He finds that evidence of destruction. However, later refinement argues that he misdated the wall by about a millennium, which is a pretty significant difference. And as far as I'm aware, nobody comes along and argues differently. Now, admittedly, the chronology in the 1930s was still in its development. Science was still, and the archaeology was still trying to figure out the chronological scheme and so forth. Interestingly, Karstein comes along and he encourages a up-and-coming archaeologist named Kathleen Kenyon to go back to the site and refine the excavation, and she does so. And she excavates from 1952 to 1958. Now, this is 50 years ago. Admittedly, much has happened in archaeology since then, significant refinement. But she finds nothing, essentially, from the 1400s, the early date. She finds a little bit from the 1300s, and she finds nothing from the 1200s. Now notice, this would be the early date, that would be the late date, and essentially there's nothing from either period. This is part of what raises the question, the problem of Jericho. Because here's what happens. People will come along and they will say, Jericho was not occupied when Israel entered Canaan. You ever heard this? Well, here's the problem. We don't know that. We don't know that. Part of the question is which date are you subscribing to? Early date, late date. So you can't just casually say it wasn't occupied when Israel entered Canaan, because then you have to ask the question, when did Israel enter Canaan? In order to refine the question. But having said that Jericho was not occupied when Israel entered Canaan, overstates the argument. In all fairness, what needs to be said is we have found no evidence of Jericho occupied. That is a different proposition than saying it was not occupied. I'll show you why this is important here in a moment. But I hope you understand the nuanced difference. To say it was not occupied implies we have thoroughly investigated it and nothing is there, period. Whereas to say we've not found evidence of it recognizes that could change. Those are very important distinctions. One thing about archaeology is things can change literally with a turn of a shovel. It used to be said that there were no more tombs to be found in the Valley of the Kings, only for someone to have to eat crow around 2000 when they did find another tomb in the Valley of the Kings. We've got to be careful about the absolute remarks that we make. Now, Garstang did find material that dated to the early dates, but it was not associated with any archaeology, or not associated with any architecture. Sort of random sherds, fill material that had some early date kind of stuff in it, but you couldn't associate it with anything. And that's what part of the problem is. Now, there's also a problem with the area that is under excavation. Now, let me explain this one. We have to ask the question about, is the site that we identify as Jericho really Jericho? See, there aren't signs that say, welcome to Jericho, population 4,062. So we have to infer whether it's Jericho or not. Now, in my opinion, it probably is. I have little reason to question and challenge the premise. But at least it's a fair question to ask. The second question that arises is, how much effect has erosion had on the site? Kathleen Kenyon, for instance, will argue the site of Jericho is badly eroded. Badly eroded. Now, if you've ever lived in the southwest United States, or western Texas, or Colorado, I can't talk about many other places, and you've been in a late summer rainstorm, where the drops come down and beat you to a pulp, and they almost sting on your bare skin. That's the way it rains here when it rains. And that kind of rain tends to be quite erosional. So her observation is a legitimate one. It's something we got to watch out for. To argue about something absolute when the site has been subject to extreme erosion, better be careful. Then there are also the poor excavation strategies. Remember, the first two projects were in the infancy, especially the first one, the German one. The second one wasn't a whole lot better, but nonetheless, efforts and progress was made. But still, when you misstate something by 1,000 years, you better sit up and take notice. And be careful about the line of argumentation. The last point is the limited area of excavation. Excavation is expensive. Kathleen Kenyon was an extremely meticulous excavator, but being extremely meticulous means that she didn't excavate very much. This is a view of Jericho. That is Jericho. That lump. It's about 10 acres. To give you some point of reference, I looked up in the Harding catalog, the campus of Harding is 275 acres. Jericho is 10 acres. Someday I'm going to figure this out. I have a hunch it probably would fit within basically the quad in front of the Heritage and the Administration Building, and maybe include the buildings, but it's really not very big. It's fairly small. This is a plan of Kathleen Kenyon's excavation. The black areas. With the shaded part. That's it. The black areas are the wall that was discovered. The rest of the shaded area in these parts are reconstructions. But the excavation here, this trench, that trench, that trench, and a couple other places, that's what Kathleen Kenyon excavated. And that is the basis upon which the argument is made. Jericho was not occupied when the Israelites came in. There's a lot of territory that hadn't been touched. Now one can say, well, wait a minute, Watzinger and Garstein came along, but we've already, and everybody basically says we can't do anything with their information. This is a very limited area that has been exposed. Now to give you some point of comparison, here's Jericho. Another site that comes into the argument that says the children of Israel didn't do it is because at Gibeon they haven't found evidence of 13th century occupation, and this is the site of Gibeon. Gibeon, I've tried to put these up here at about the same scale, so that Gibeon is this, and only the shaded area are the parts that have been excavated. To argue that it was not occupied is a bit of a stretch. We can say, I think with fairness, we have found no evidence of its occupation. But to say it was not is overstating the case. And things can change with the turn of a shovel. And that, my friends, is the problem with Jericho.